While she has had many iconic looks throughout the Star Wars movies, Princess Leia's most iconic and recognizable look is her original one from 1977 Star Wars, retroactively retitled Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope. In her white senator gown and distinctive hairdo, she is striking from her first moments on screen when she hides the stolen Death Star plans in R2-D2 and sends him off with a mission and a message in her most desperate hour. She'd remain in this look throughout the first film with the hood up initially and down throughout the rest of the film, until the ceremony at the end when she appears in something more in line with what one might expect of a traditional princess. Which is the same outfit from the film's original theatrical poster, as well as a Hildebrandt Brothers reinterpretation of that poster. So when the time came for Kenner to make action figures both small and large, this was the primary look they went to. Not only was it the main look for the bulk of the film, it was far more action figure friendly than the other. The earliest prototype of this costume was built by Kenner on top of a Fisher-Price Adventure Person figure. While awkward and clunky, the vinyl cape and all-white outfit is present in this prototype. Here, Princess Leia has brown hair that is a reasonable match to Carrie Fisher's dark brown with auburn highlighted hair. The final figure, as produced by Kenner, would stray significantly from the on-screen look, as well as the Adventure Person prototype. In the initial years of the Star Wars toy line, Kenner often leaned more into playable and toyetic looks, rather than striving for 100% on-screen accurate representations. Those early figures took the look and redesigned and simplified them to make the toy easier and cheaper to produce, which kept the figures more friendly to the late 1970s budget-conscious public still reeling from gas shortages and recessions that marked the first half of the decade. She would first ship as part of the early bird kit promotion Kenner came up with to try and make up for not having the 3 3/4 action figure line ready for Christmas of 1977. And when Star Wars figures finally arrived on shelves, she would be single carded as one of the original 12 figures released. Rather than a dress, the Princess Leia figure has a white pantsuit with a black and white belt. Instead of flowing sleeves, she has puffy, cuffed sleeves. The belt is square and rectangular, a significant stray in design from the silver on-screen belt. Gone is the attached hood for her white Senate gown, replaced by a vinyl cape that allowed the suggestion of a hood. Overall, the cape suggests the dress she would wear in the movie without giving her the chunky legs that both Ben Kenobi and Tusken Raider figures received. The figure also has black hair, which seems to be an odd choice, but likely one made to keep paint applications to a minimum. The original Princess Leia figure has 2 paint applications, black for her eyes, hair, and belt, and light peach for her hands due to the arms being made in all-white plastic. Her head was molded from a peach-colored plastic, so no paint was necessary for a skin tone. She comes with the blaster shipped in both black and blue plastic that is a reasonable interpretation of her on-screen blaster in the beginning of the movie. Kenner's rendition of the Defender sporting blaster is close enough to pass for most kids' Death Star escape playtime, and was easily lost by the original generation of Star Wars kids. This weapon would appear again in 1980 and 1981 with subsequent variations of Princess Leia, both Bespin and Hoth, even though she did not use the weapon in the film or in those outfits. For Return of the Jedi, Leia figures would have weapons appropriate to those outfits. The original Leia blaster was produced through the length of Kenner's line as the original Princess Leia figure, as well as the Bespin and Hoth variants, were produced through the end of the line, with the planned reissue of the 1978 Leia and the Power of the Force line with her own coin that did not happen due to the cancellation of the Kenner Star Wars collection in 1985. Kenner did not revisit their 3 3/4 version of Leia in this outfit to produce a more accurate figure at any point between 1978 to 1985. Kenner in this time frame did not really remake figures. There were several instances of running changes, such as the change in Han Solo's head sculpt, the Jawa figure shifting from having a vinyl cape to a soft goods cape, the blue Snaggletooth becoming short and red, and the Death Squad commander going through many name changes to try and keep him relevant to each film, as well as addressing the fact that there were no characters called Death Squad Commander in any of the Star Wars films. Kenner would revisit this version of Leia in their large-size action figure scale, as well as in the Micro Collection line of 1982, where two different die-cast metal pre-posed versions would be released as part of the Death Star World subset. After the end of Kenner's toy line, this version of Leia would not return to store shelves in 3 3/4 range until 1993, when Bendham's released a series of figures from the original trilogy. Among the Bendham's offerings was a single Princess Leia. They went for her white gown with Star Puff's look, as this was the most memorable of her original looks. Despite how disappointing the Bendham figures were, and are, this version of Leia was closer to screen accuracy. Her hair was the correct shade of brown, and she had flowing sleeves instead of the cuff sleeves of the original Kenner figure. She still has pants though, and she has no hood, or the suggestion of a hood at her collar. The pants are a strange decision by Bendham's, considering other figures such as Ben Kenobi, Yoda, Bib Fortuna, the Emperor, and the Royal Guard were all given a solid but bendable base. She also did not include a blaster or weapon, which is probably for the best, as Bendham's molded weapons into the hands of these figures. Luckily, the Bendham's line was short-lived, and by 1995, Kenner would be back in the Star Wars action figure game. In 1995, Kenner, now a subsidiary of Hasbro, would launch Power of the Force 2. Among the initial 9 figures was Princess Leia Organa in her white gown. Unlike the original 1978 figure, this one is not screen accurate. While the outfits for the figures were closer to their on-screen appearances than the original 1978 line, there were still several artistic liberties taken to make them conform to action figure standards of the day. Notably is the now comic, overly buff and muscular look, and once again changes were made to Leia's iconic look. We'll overlook the bad face sculpt, as there does appear to have at least been an attempt at getting Carrie Fisher's likeness, no matter how poorly executed. And the figure does have the correct brown hair. The belt and sleeves are correct, as is the collar of the outfit. There is still no hood. Instead, she is given a big plastic cape that clips onto the neck. Instead of a soft goods skirt, she's given a thin, rubbery, flexible plastic skirt that can be removed to sit the figure down, revealing white pants and boots underneath. The cape, as well as the slit in the skirt, and the overly muscular look make it appear that the sculptor of the figure took more of a cue from the 1977 posters than the on-screen character portrayed by Carrie Fisher. This figure included 2 weapons, a sporting blaster and a rifle. The sporting blaster is much closer to being accurate to the on-screen weapon than the original, but there are still artistic liberties taken with the sculpt. The rifle is a design completely created by Kenner with no on-screen counterpart. Since it's an extra pack-in weapon, this is not that big of a crime. Also worth noting, Kenner designers had a pretty astute understanding of the Star Wars universe, so even though it had no on-screen counterpart, it does look as though it fits in the Star Wars universe. This was also standard practice for action figures of the 1990s. Extra accessories increased play value without any consideration of the original source material. Kenner's Jurassic Park and Batman lines are where this practice first truly rose to prominence at Kenner. While overall this figure is closer to being accurate than the original 1978 one was, it's still a huge misstep due to the unflattering sculpt and the overly 1990s body. At the time though, this was the norm, and at the time Star Wars collectors just accepted this was how it was. There was no indication that there would ever be a revisit of this look by Kenner. Still, no one was satisfied with this figure. So much so, there were rumors Carrie Fisher hated it so much it had been pulled from shelves. Early internet toy collecting groups trotted this rumor out to explain its scarcity. Likely nothing more than Kenner under Hasbro underproducing a female figure and short packing her. This was standard for both Hasbro and Kenner starting roughly in 1987 through the early days of Power of the Force 2. Ironically, it was the heavy demand for this Princess Leia, dubbed Monkey Face Leia by detractors, that would persuade Kenner to start releasing more women figures. In 1998, Kenner would attempt to fix its New Hope Leia wrongs twice. First, in early 1998, they would release a subgroup of the Power of the Force 2 line under the name the Princess Leia Collection. Of the four sets offered in this assortment was Princess Leia and R2-D2 from A New Hope. Here we have a much better head sculpt of Princess Leia, and while it does have a sculpted pose, it's much closer to a neutral pose than the rest of the Power of the Force 2 line. Leia is given a more auburn brown hair color and a soft goods dress with a replica of the hood from the actual costume, as well as a silver belt that very closely resembles what we see on screen. This set did not include a weapon, just R2-D2. Early toy photography that was used to solicit the wave to retailers and appeared in magazines such as Toy Fair, Lee's Action Figure Digest, and Star Wars Insider showed that the Leia was initially intended to include the pistol, nicknamed the Smuggler Blaster, initially released with Han Solo figures of this era, but reused for several figures throughout the first years of Power of the Force 2. The Prototype Archives website shows that originally the R2-D2 was not just the 1995 R2-D2 repacked into the set, but was initially intended to be the first R2-D2 in the 3 3/4 range that would include Death Star plans. This was by way of a pop-out tray. At its release, this was probably the best rendition of Leia in this outfit, especially when compared to the 3 previously released versions. To this day, this remains a pretty good figure. However, the soft goods and face paint apps were a little bit more doll-like. Later, in 1998, Kenner would release a single-carded mainline Power of the Force 2 Leia in this costume that strictly adhered to action figure guidelines. Completely resculpted and not sharing parts with the Princess Leia collection figure, this was the most accurate and visually pleasing version to come out of the entire Power of the Force 2 line. The figure's bubble had a sticker proudly proclaiming all new likeness, which directly addressed the frequent feedback of how bad that original 1995 figure was. In the toy industry, 2 years is the standard turnaround for a new toy, so it does seem as though Kenner got right on top of fixing their Princess Leia issue as soon as early feedback started rolling in from the initial releases of Power of the Force. Now, the head sculpt here is a fairly good likeness of Carrie Fisher. This is probably the best Leia face likeness of the entire Power of the Force 2 line, and this was also probably the best Carrie Fisher likeness from the first movie in 3 3/4 for the next few decades. Her outfit is a faithful and accurate recreation of the on-screen outfit, complete with the hood, belt, and boots, mirroring the actual outfit worn. The various folds of the fabric give it an extra realism that set this figure apart from all previous Leias. Less doll-like than the Leia collection, this was a posable action figure. The faithful attempt at recreation, however, is the biggest flaw of this figure. Here the skirt is a molded plastic and is not removable, making the figure's legs all but useless. She cannot sit down and you can't change the legs around. She also still suffers from 1990s action pose sculpting. Her arms are sculpted so you can pose her holding the modified Imperial blaster she's included with in both hands, very similar to one of the more iconic images of Leia from A New Hope. However, the specific posing again limits her, as it's not a neutral enough pose to truly be dropped seamlessly into any kid's play pattern, or even any adult action figure display or diorama. This figure was such a good sculpt, and so close to perfect, that Hasbro would re-release the figure on cardbacks twice, and reuse the mold for the 2005 San Diego Comic-Con exclusive holographic Princess Leia figure. One of the most faithful recreations of Leia's sporting blaster is included with this figure. However, the Imperial blaster is modified and doesn't quite resemble any of the versions of this blaster rifle that Leia uses in the first film, or in any film. The next version of this figure would be released in early 2000 as part of the last wave of Power of the Force 2, before Hasbro would rebrand the line as Power of the Jedi. This version included the focus of both the last wave of Power of the Force 2, as well as Episode 1 branded figures, the Comtech chips. These chips promised to reproduce key dialogue and sounds from the Star Wars movies. They were not quite successful, but were cutting-edge toy technology for the era. Collectors were mostly unimpressed with Comtech technology overall. And the Princess Leia released in this last wave was also pretty unimpressive. The head sculpt was the first to include the hood up, but it's still an odd sculpt. This figure is designed to recreate the first time we see Leia when she stooped over R2-D2 recording her message and hiding the data disk of the Death Star plans in his memory system. The figure does recreate that pose, but it's just too specific to be a great overall figure. The soft goods skirt is a thin, flimsy material that feels rather cheap, and not only is the face sculpt slightly off, but the paint app on the face is bad. The peach paint is a little too orange, and the red of the lipstick slightly garish. Overall, this entire figure is a miss and a mess. It's little wonder Hasbro never reissued it, nor reused the head sculpt or top torso piece, and reverted to the 1998 Princess Leia new likeness figure for future re-releases of this version of Leia. The weapon here is a fairly good reproduction of the sporting blaster, but it's definitely not quite there and a step or two back from the blaster that came with the 1998 new likeness Leia. We next see a new version of this Leia in the 25th anniversary collection, where she and Luke are preparing for their iconic swing over the chasm in the Death Star. Released in 2002, this figure is pre-posed to recreate the scene, which makes it very much not an action figure so much as a small statue with some movable limbs. While the pose makes sense, there is nothing that makes sense of the face sculpt. It doesn't look like Carrie Fisher in any way, and in my opinion is worse than the original 1995 Power of the Force sculpt. Toward the end of 2003, there would be another release of this look in a 2-pack Death Star trash compactor, which included Chewbacca. The figure would have pre-posed limbs that made her not particularly useful outside of the trash compactor diorama piece she came with. Again, we have a terrible head sculpt. Also, a lot of these had bad paint apps that made the white of the eyes look watery. The less we say about this figure, the better. From 2004 to 2005, after the release of Revenge of the Sith, Hasbro would celebrate the entire Star Wars saga with a series of lines. One of these lines, dubbed Vintage Figures, would feature highly articulated figures with soft goods and mini paint applications. These were promoted as collector-friendly action figures and were packaged on recreations of vintage Kenner cards. This line would eventually evolve into the present day, as of this recording, vintage collection. Although the only true vintage thing about either the original waves in 2004 or the modern vintage collection is the card back harkening back to the original Kenner toy line. Among the first figures released in 2004 was Princess Leia Organa in her classic look from A New Hope. This 2004 release was almost perfect. The sculpting, the paint applications, and the posability are superior to any previous version. It was as if all the highs of previous releases in 1998, both the Princess Leia Collection version and the all-new likeness version, had been taken and were used to create a single figure. The vintage-style packaging only added to the overall pleasing nature of this figure. However, this is not Carrie Fisher's face. Also, the only weapon included is an Imperial blaster. This version of Leia really requires a version of the sporting blaster if you're trying to make a figure of Leia in her most iconic look. Both of these things are unfortunate because everything else about this figure is so good. If the face sculpt had been on point and they'd included the right blaster, this would have been the definitive Princess Leia from Star Wars. In 2005, Hasbro would try again. As part of their early bird kit, Hasbro would again pay homage to the past. Just like the original set, this early bird kit would include Luke, Leia, Chewbacca, and R2-D2. The Leia would not be the same as the Vintage Collection original trilogy figure and would be a fully resculpted action figure with all new parts. The outfit was highly accurate, but the plastic of the skirt as well as the sculpted pose makes this figure far more of a small statue than an action figure. This was Hasbro's second attempt at a hood-up Princess Leia, and the face sculpt here is much better than the Comtech 2 Leia, but it still doesn't look like Princess Leia. So while this is a nice attempt, it's still an unsatisfactory recreation of Leia in this look. Also, it has the wrong weapon for this look. The only blaster we see Leia use with her hood up in A New Hope is the sporting blaster, rather than an Imperial blaster. The potential was here, but the execution falls woefully short. Hasbro would not revisit this look of Princess Leia again until 2015. Part of a Mission Series 2-pack with Stormtrooper disguised Luke Skywalker, this Leia returns to 5 points of articulation. While she does have a molded skirt, it's actually split down the center to create 2 legs, so this Leia can sit and has articulation not possible in other versions of this look. The face sculpt does leave much to be desired. She looks almost as if the sculptor was attempting an animated look to help her blend in with the then current Star Wars Rebels figures that were being released concurrently. It's a nice reproduction of the costume and a very nice kid-friendly rendition of the character, suited well for any actual kids interested in playing Star Wars in 2015 with action figures. But the face sculpt is still off. Also, despite there being 2 figures in the set, only 1 weapon is included, and it's an Imperial blaster. The figure still had these same issues when it was released again in another 2-pack during the Force Awakens releases, repackaged with A New Hope Han Solo. Again, this is a fine Leia, it just isn't great. They only included an Imperial blaster as a functional weapon, and then of course there's a ridiculously over-the-top 1990s style launching weapon for the kids. In 2017, Hasbro would celebrate the 40th anniversary of Star Wars in its 3 3/4 range with a titanium series of figures that included Leia. Included was a stand with a backing that has a reproduction of the cell block corridor behind her. It was reversible, and on the other side there were images of Leia. This stand could be combined with other figures in the titanium series to create a display. This Leia is pre-pose and includes an Imperial blaster with the red blast effect. She also has metal components, but is mostly plastic. The paint apps are nice, but the likeness again is off, and yet again no attempt at the sporting blaster. The next release of Leia in 3 3/4 range was an actual reproduction of the original 1978 figure. Dubbed the Retro Collection, Hasbro began re-releasing reproductions of the original Kenner figures. Initially released as a Target and fan channel exclusive, this is almost an exact replica of the original figure. The figure is a tad bit smaller than the original release, but it's barely noticeable. And while a fun bit of nostalgia and a great way to get a nice minty fresh version of this figure without having to pay exorbitant aftermarket prices, there is no new ground tread here. It also included a replica of the original blaster for those of us looking for a nice display piece. Rather than spending a ton of money on vintage, this hits the spot. The Retro Collection A New Hope Leia would be released again in 2022 as part of a Hasbro Pulse and Shop Disney exclusive box set of the original 6 figures released in this scale. There are no differences in the figure of the 2022 release than in 2029. This brings us to our final entry in this retrospective. Released in 2024, the Vintage Collection finally revisited Princess Leia 20 years later. And honestly, in my opinion, it was well worth the wait. Both weapons included with this figure are accurate to the first film and look great with the figure. The sporting blaster is very nice and sized appropriately to the figure. It's also one of the best recreations of the sporting blaster we've gotten so far. The outfit is accurate, and the sculpting of the fabric makes it look like she just came off screen. The included hood pieces clip on and means you can have Leia either hooded or hood down. The face sculpt is the best likeness of Carrie Fisher we have ever gotten in 3 3/4 range, and frankly should be the default if Hasbro ever revisits this look. The one drawback to the figure, and the one thing I personally wish was different, is the plastic skirt. It makes posability a little bit difficult. However, everything else about this figure is so on point, I can overlook this, especially with the last few decades of misfires for this look. If this version of Leia is never again revisited in 3 3/4 range, I personally am satisfied with this one. I do hold out hope that at some point Hasbro will re-release this figure, but with the soft goods skirt. This is a case where I do think a second release of the figure makes sense for instances where one might want to be able to pose Leia sitting down. And that brings us to the end of this retrospective. Which one of these is your favorite Leia from the original film? Hopefully it's not the Bendhams. Let me know in the comments. Again, hopefully it's not the Bendhams. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, and you should subscribe. I do regular videos on vintage Kenner Star Wars items, as well as lore and history of various vintage and retro toy lines. Thank you again for watching. I'll see you again in the next one.